Dwellers on the Nile, The Life, History, Religion, and Literature of the Ancient Egyptians by E. A. Wallis Budge. We are continuing in The Pharaoh and His Subjects, which is chapter 3. The objects of every Egyptian war or raid was loot, or as it was euphemistically called, tribute. Let me throw in a side note that whether one's Shia or Sunni or whatever, it's believed that Muhammad ibn Abdullah taught that God's curse is upon those who fight to extend borders, to capture resources, to capture slaves, or to force conversion. But, of course, the Egyptians weren't Muslims, so, well, I guess there may have been some if you translate into Egyptian, but you know what I mean. Great kings like Usertsen, Sen Usrit III, and Thothmes III established their officers in various towns in the Sudan and Western Asia, not to teach the natives the secrets of Egyptian civilization, but to collect the tribute and to send it to Egypt annually in order to save the royal masters the trouble of going to fetch it. The king, every great temple, each governor of a nome, and every feudal noble maintained an armed force to protect their interest, but order was maintained chiefly by the Menchaiu, okay? Machaiu. Okay, yeah, that's close enough. Were imported from Nubia. Under the new kingdom, mercenaries were predominant in the army, and Ramses II and Ramses III hired Libyans and other foreigners from the islands of the Mediterranean and the seacoast to fight their battles. At a later period, the Greeks, Carians, and others, from a military point of view, were masters of Egypt. The weapons of the pre-dynastic Egyptian soldier were a stout cudgel, like that used by watchmen in Egypt of today, a mace or club, so in the center, or the pole with the bit, consisting of a short stick with lump of bitumen on the top, or a perforated stone, later copper head. 3. A spear made of wood, and a slice of flint fastened to one end. Bow and arrows, the latter made of reeds, tipped with flints. A large flint knife or dagger. A battle axe, formed by tying a slab of stone or flint to a short, stout wooden handle, or by fixing it in a cleft of the handle. Sometimes the axe was double-headed, the stones being tied to the handle with leather thongs. The stone head had various shapes. Some was like that, some was like that, some was, and a couple holes there. The holes in the last received the leather thongs, which tied it into the handle. The other shapes of the axe heads were, sort of the whale tail thing and sort of the eye looking thing. But actually that was the above view, because you got and then the stick in the middle there. Each of these was perforated to receive the handle. A curved stick, similar to that carried by the peoples of the eastern desert today, and a short pike. The soldier wore a very short tunic with a belt above it, and from this a tall reel, or artificial, hung down behind. Oh, a tail, artificial reel, hung down behind. Let's remember that the boomerang, the Egyptians talked about this accursed land and said it was in the direction off into the ocean of where Australia is, and the Australians likewise said that, we traded with the Egyptians and they wanted to know, magic and, some stuff. So that's what they communicated about. And there's physical evidence of the trade between those two cultures too. So things were a lot more global than people would think. The soldier wore a very short tunic with a belt above it, and from this, okay, I already said that. In his thick hair were one or two feathers of the red parrot, now no longer found in Egypt, and the standard under which he fought had for its head the figure of the hawk of Horus. The primitive battle axe with a stone head was probably the original of the hieroglyph, which at a later period was the sign that we now say is a sign for a god. Here we have it seems, a reminiscence of the cult of stones. Under the Middle Kingdom, if not earlier, the soldier defended himself with a shield, which was made of wood or wickerwork, covered with hide and sometimes strengthened with a metal rim and bolts. It was held in the left hand when the soldier was fighting, and on the march he carried it on his, well, that's not really a shield, but, and on the march he carried it on his back. It varied in shape. Sometimes it was like, it looked more like a tombstone with a hole, and other times it was kind of, angled upwards, kind of. And sometimes had a boss. The front was often decorated with tribal marks, etc. The form of the primitive bow was, the kind of arch thinking, from which are derived the later hieroglyphs, the handle there, and the more recognizable as a bow. It was held in the left hand. The arrows were tipped with metal heads and winged with 5 feathers. The quiver usually carried on the back. The head was covered with a cloth cap, ornamented sometimes with feathers, as the hieroglyphs show. In latter times the king wore a helmet made of leather and metal, a sling or catapult. Ka ah. Ka. Well, that makes sense. Extending something, right? Was made of leather, and pebbles for it were carried in a little bag suspended from the belt. The boomerang was as useful to the soldier as to the fowler. Under the New Kingdom, many varieties of the bronze dagger and knife were used. They were from 7 to 10 inches in length and were often set in beautifully decorated and inlaid handles. The battle axe had a bronze head and a comparatively short, curved handle. And you had the... but other forms used, more stereotypically axe, because you have the blade part kind of drawn separately. Well, I mean the sharp part. And the less recognizable, kind of 2 point in between, are more like a knife, you would think, but you have 2 holes there too. The latter kings often use a sort of scimitar. In battle, and a club or mace, like their pre-dynastic ancestors. The Ku'i Ras, only found under the New Kingdom, was made of several rows of shield-shaped metal plates, fastened by bronze pins. The use of horses and chariots in war was borrowed from the Hyksos, Hittites, and other peoples of northern Syria. The horse was introduced into Babylonia by the Kassites, and after the invasion of their country by the Hyksos, the Egyptians quickly realized its importance when swiftness of attack and mobility were required. Many men who were eligible for service in the army were enrolled by the military scribe of the district. Oh, I forgot how to read that, but, it's this scribe symbol, the archer, and the guy going in 3 things, a man of great power and authority. The recruits were called Nefru, as opposed to the veterans. Yeah, u, e, I, a. And until about 1500 BCE, the army consisted of foot soldiers entirely. Under the 18th dynasty, there was an army of Upper Egypt and an army of Lower Egypt, and these presumably were the originals of the Chalcedonians and the Hermotybians mentioned by Herodotus. Oh, would it be Hermotybians, Chalcedonians. Okay, by Herodotus, Book 4, 116. These were subdivided into 2 battalions, each of which had a special title. Thus, there was the Sa, or maybe it was just Sa, the Sa of Pharaoh and the Sa of Amun, and so on. The officers were usually friends of the king or noblemen, and their nominees and their military and other titles were many. Soldiers seem to have been classified according to their duties as combatants or non-combatants. Among the former were the spearmen, the bowmen, the men with spears and shields, and the cavalry. Thunt, Hutter, Thunthutere, Thunthutere, the tent. The Nubians loved and admired the horses and made fine cavalrymen. In many of the tombs of the Nubian kings at Nuri, the skeletons of horses have been found, showing that these fine warriors wished to have their horses with them in the other world. Now, let me make clear one point that I perhaps would have made more sense earlier in the chapter, but I do not believe that generational slavery is right, that you're just born into being a slave. I don't believe that's, and there are other ways to get freed from these. The night boat of the sun entity on the great river of the Duat, or the underworld. Entity stands under a canopy formed by the body of the serpent Mahn. At the bows is the beetle of Xpe, or Kepthera. Xpe, yeah. And behind him are up Uatu Sa'a and the lady of the boat. Behind the entity are Hakan and the 4 entities who form the crew that paddle the boat along. And that from the Book of the Gates, talked about the different gatekeepers and the people, the leaders of the different house and that sort of thing. That's the Egyptian Book of Heaven and Hell. Yes, that's already up. So you can go back in the ancient Egyptian list and look at that if you want. The Egyptian sailor, the Nile being the great highway of Egypt, the Egyptians were from the earliest times compelled to be builders of boats, barges, lighters, warboats, ferries, etc., and to be skilled watermen. The entities were supposed to sail over the sky and boats, and even the sun entity, Ra, had his morning boat and his evening boat. Those they considered to be gods and the kings alike had their progress through the country in boats, and the Namarch and the noblemen maintained the private ferry boat, and probably also a houseboat of the type of the modern the Habiyah. The current in the Nile carried the boats down the river, but to ascend it, a sail was necessary. Now, one of the things that we can look at with these boats is the symbol that here we are in the mind and the astral body and stuff like this, but except for the soul and spirit itself, all these things that were the consciousness itself is as a vehicle, but the mind would be called, but not mind in a purely psychological sense. But that's, and you have the different aspects that we're referring to, and what does all this thought do to you? For the transport of granite from Aswan and stone from the other quarries in Upper Egypt, large rafts were used, were specially broad lighters. Warboats carried a crew of about 20 men and a number of armed guards. Senefru brought a large quantity of cedar wood from Lebanon in sea-going boats, but whether he built them or hired them from the merchants of Capuna, Byblos, or from Kefteu, Phoenicians, is not certain. Several kings maintained a fleet in the Mediterranean and a fleet in the Red Sea to bring copper from Sinai and protect merchant craft. The Mediterranean fleet of Ramses III cooperated with his land forces and enabled him to win a great victory. The early Egyptians made the river boats of papyrus and worked them with paddles or steering poles, and they were so constructed that, when used as punts, the bows could be easily thrust over the riverbank. The entity Isis sailed unharmed over the lakes in the delta in a papyrus boat, and a belief existed that crocodiles would not attack anyone in a boat made of papyrus. A very early form of the boat was made by tying two large bundles of reeds together, side by side, and the passenger set between them and worked a sort of paddle. This kind of boat was called Sixnui and is in use today in Nubia under the name of Toph. Mr. J. W. Crowfoot and I each crossed the Nile at Samna on a Toph in 1906. Riverboats of all periods were shallow and broad in the beam. The crews were described generally as men of the sail, or men of the steering poles. The sailors in royal service were called Apru. The pilot, or lookout man. Yimurayu set in the bows, and the steersman, Yure Hamit, stood in the stern. The texts show that boat accidents were common in the Nile, and that many sailors suffered shipwreck, especially in the cataracts, where submerged rocks were numerous. When the north wind failed, and the boat began to float downstream, the crew were obliged to disembark and, forming a line along the riverbank, to tow their boat up the river, a laborious and exhausting task. The sailors of the boat of Ra were sometimes obliged to tow the boat of their lord in this fashion. The ferryman was called Hamu. And there are apparent connections to various things of the natural and man-made world in the reference of these entities, but we can look at some of the patterns, and perhaps it teaches us something that's not quite so empirical about the physical, about the psychological or the spiritual worlds to which these entities that were worshipped may or may not attach themselves to our personal lives.